All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to ask folks who are gathered here in the auditorium to take their seats as we begin our last panel of the day. Our closing panel considers the day's conversations and the question, where do we go from here? Our moderator and my colleague, Matthew Watkins, editor-in-chief for the Texas Tribune, serves as moderator and is joined by Tiffany Puett, executive director of the Institute for Diversity and Civic Life, which serves as a program partner for today's conversations. J.B. Smith, editor-in-chief of the new Waco-based news organization, the Waco Bridge. Michael Waters, lead pastor for Abundant Life African Methodist Episcopal Church here in Dallas. And I literally don't have Kerby's name, so I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself because I don't have your title here, but we'll have you introduce yourself in a second. But we'll have 45 minutes for conversation, 15 minutes of Q&A through texastribune.org/ask. And with that, I turn the program over to Matthew.
All right, thank you, Matt. Thank you all for sticking with us. It's been a long but very engaging day in conversation around religion and journalism in this state and beyond. We're going to sort of, as Matt said, kind of recap the conversation, but I think also I really just want to talk a little bit about, particularly where does journalism go from here? What do we want to be seeing from journalism? What can we be doing to get better diagnosing the situation out there right now? And we've got a great group of different perspectives to go on this issue. I'm going to start with the man who needs no introduction here, Kerby. So you can introduce yourself, but I also want to just start with sort of the question of, from what we heard today, from the work that you do as an academic, where is your mind right now, big picture, in terms of how we, and when I say we in this circumstance, I mean me and JB and the rest of us journalists in the room and outside the room, are doing to this question of telling the story of religious life in Texas and beyond.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And just by way of introduction, so I'm Kerby Goff. I'm Associate Director of Research for the Boniuk Institute for the Study and Advancement of Religious Tolerance at Rice University. It is a long title, but so what we do is we study the conditions under which religious diversity leads to solidarity and collaboration or conflict and violence. We look at that here in the States, in Texas and in Houston, but also internationally. And so we're really concerned with how issues of religious diversity shape sort of the social and political fabric of life at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level. And, I was thinking kind of what are two sort of takeaways so far. One thing that we've learned today is that when we talk about religion in Texas, there's an abundance of it. As we learned at the beginning, and I don't mean abundance in a lot of religion going on, but a lot of different types of religion, right? There's an abundance of religious diversity. And instead of seeing that primarily as a problem, I think my first point is to see the promise of religious diversity and religious abundance in Texas, and to really consider how we can look at religion in Texas beyond just polarization and the problems that come with that. I think of some of the examples that we've heard even today of religious groups being involved in civic engagement, working to solve community problems. I think those are really important. And as we heard, they often cross lines of partisan difference and religious difference, and that's really important. Another is just taking seriously religious traditions and religious identities. Sometimes we like to highlight the ways that religions collaborate in sort of progressive ways, but it's also important to recognize the way in which maybe more traditional religious groups work together to solve problems that we all care about. And we've heard a little bit about that today, but I think that's something that we, as we research religious leaders, particularly in Houston as well, those are some of the things that we see. And then, of course, I think really importantly is to move beyond just focusing on Christian religious groups in Texas. So moving beyond the 14% that we talked about in terms of white evangelicals and really looking at the diversity of religious groups in Texas. I think those are kind of the two areas that are takeaways for me, and two of the things that we focus on in our institute.
Dr. Puett, I hear this call for better portraying the diversity of religion in Texas. I also hear this call for journalists not just doing surface level reporting, but really, immersing themselves in communities. I believe that both of those things are the right message to be sending to journalists, but I also sit here as a journalist and it feels like a very overwhelming task, right? There's no secret that the media industry has been shrinking in recent years. The number of journalists, working in this state has gone down. And we're talking about just so many different communities, so many different religions, even within, sects or denominations or religions, so much diversity of thought. I mean, Governor Greg Abbott and Sister Norma are both practicing Catholics, right? And they view things very differently on a lot of different issues. How should I, as a journalist, be thinking about trying to do that work when it feels like there is so much work to be done in that regard?
Well, I think one thing we found today, and something that's really been highlighted, is the complexity of religion. And probably many folks here today already came into this conversation recognizing that no religion is a monolith, but that's definitely been reiterated today time and time again. Some of the things I really have appreciated hearing today that I think are really helpful. In the last panel, I really liked what Dan Bolger had to say about widening the lens of how religion happens, thinking beyond religion as just a matter of sort of personal belief, or it's just something that you show up and do in church on Sunday, but recognizing that religions play a lot of roles in society. People are impacted by religion even when they are not particularly religious. People interact with religion when they're not particularly religious. So in addition to my role as the executive director at IDCL, I also teach in the Department of Religion at St. Edward's University, and I teach an Intro to Religions class. And I often talk to my students about thinking about religion from the perspective of the 3 B's, which are belief, behavior, and belonging. So if we think about like how does religion impact people's lives, it's not just what they believe, it's the way that they act in the world. And then it also tells them something about their identities, their community. And for some people, religion may be more one of those B's than the others, right? So religion may be more identity than it is belief. Or it may be more of what you do and less of what you believe per se. So I think looking at that kind of nuance can be helpful. And then I would also say as well, something that came up in one of the panels too that Erica Ramirez was really talking a lot about with the transnational movements that shape religions in Texas. I think looking for those threads, right? That many religious communities, religious actors, they are connected to other communities, and that their interests are broader than just this one place. That doesn't simplify anything, but I do think that it helps. It helps get to some of those nuances and intricacies, and helps tell this bigger story.
Dr. Waters, you are, in leading a religious community, and you are, I would imagine, interacting in different ways with the media, with journalism, as a consumer, as someone who people might turn to. I believe you've written, for media at times as well. Tell us just a little bit about your relationship with journalism, your community's relationship with journalism, and what feels like it's going well and what's not going well.
Well, first of all, very grateful to be with you today. And I think if I can speak from an African-American experience, particularly within the Christian realm, there is a level of suspicion, maybe even a hermeneutic of suspicion, as it relates to the media in terms of how our communities have historically been represented and the harm that has come through that representation. I don't think it has always been the intention of harm, but when you don't know a community, you tend to exegete that community in harmful ways. One example, for instance, would be what happened to Jeremiah Wright during the presidential election of Barack Obama. And this viral clip from 2003, very singular line, that is actually a deep part of the African American prophetic tradition, where he said, "God damn America." And that reverberated, of course, across medias. But guess who else said America may go to hell? That was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and many others over the centuries. It's a rhetorical form. It was a way of critique. And I think it's important because the Black community, not the Black community exclusively, but marginalized, oppressed communities who are on, as Bailey, Lew, and Segovia would say, who are interpreting or critiquing from the selvedge, from the margins. They offer a critique that is intended to resist and ultimately to transform the margins. And sometimes there is an abrasive rhetoric that is released, but when it's received by media or by populations who are unfamiliar with this rhetoric, it becomes something more, and it is wielded back as violence against the community. At the same time, we know historically, particularly, say, the Civil Rights Movement, and you can even go back to the antebellum period and the work of Frederick Douglass and others. There's an understanding that in the work for liberation, media can be a partner to make sure that the message and the values and the ideals are reaching a wider populace. And so to answer the question, it's like the whole Dickens, the best of times, the worst of times, right? Kind of depends on what's happening in that moment. Could be a great compliment to the community to help us in our cause for justice, which is greater now maybe than it's ever been before. But at the same time, I think there's an opportunity to get to know the community much better, to make sure that the harms that come are minimized.
JB, I want to talk a little bit about getting to know that community better. But first, for people who are in the room who might not know about the Waco Bridge, can you explain a little bit about what you were doing and what you were building in Waco?
Sure. So I've been in Waco for 27 years with the Legacy newspaper there, and have just taken the job of as editor-in-chief of the Waco Bridge. We're a nonprofit newsroom with local editorial control, but with the very valuable backing of the Texas Tribune for back office and moral support. So we're working very closely hand in glove with them. But what we are trying to do is focus on things that are important to residents in a way that will help them become more engaged in their communities. And so rather than chasing ambulances and covering sports games, which all that's important, of course, but we're going to be covering, we're going to use the different innovative ways to convey information about how to get involved in your community. We'll be covering, some of the public affairs topics such as education, healthcare, housing, economic development, and when you talk about getting the community to know itself, if you're in Waco, Texas, you probably need to cover religion because the faith communities are such an important part of Waco.
Okay, so let's talk about that now. I mean, the Waco Bridge has not fully launched as an outlet, but you have been doing a lot of work talking to people in that community, not just in the religious communities. They're all different aspects of the community. But as you mentioned, I mean, Waco, home to the largest Baptist university in the world, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
It is, there are many churches there of very, diverse backgrounds and affiliations and everything like that. That has been a big group that you've been trying to reach out to and speak with. What are you hearing from them, and what are you doing to approach them as you lead up to and build this newsroom and try to understand the needs of the community from there?
Well, we happen to be speaking tomorrow night, the three of the initial team. We're speaking at a church that is having a community series about community public issues, and so we're starting there with the Baptist church as a kind of a progressive Baptist church, but we see ourselves as trying to reach people in all the ways and all the kind of communities that they're in, and in places like Waco, church is a big part of your identity, a big part of your community, how people get together and do things together, and so we're open to meeting with other churches too. And when you talk about Baylor, I think it's important to know that when I think a challenge for a young reporter, especially one maybe that doesn't come from a religious background, is to understand the complexity of that, and that of course Baylor is a big influence on Waco, and it's part of a relatively conservative tradition. But within that tradition, it's actually a moderating force, and a lot of what comes from Baylor is cultural. A lot of cultural activities that come from Baylor, and then a lot of people who are professors or somehow connected to Baylor are in some of these churches that are fighting for social justice and LGBT acceptance, and are actually some of the more progressive, in some cases, some of the more progressive elements in Waco. So it's very complex. It's a very complex dynamic there. So I think if you're a journalist, you have to understand that and not conflate Baylor with whatever's happening in the Southern Baptist Convention. And as we have to learn when we're journalists, Baylor is not a Southern Baptist school. It's a Texas Baptist school, and that's so there's a lot you have to learn about that. And I think I think also what I heard today from the previous panel was about smaller demographics, let's say, that religious groups that often don't come into the limelight until something happens, and that's their first contact with the media. And I felt like, yeah, that's kind of a problem, because 9/11, after 9/11 was the first time I had contact with a local mosque. And they were very, very gracious. I talked to the mosque president and got to know him. But I felt like, I probably should have reached out to them before. I should have known these people before. And later I went to Ramadan meals with them and really had great conversations with some of them, heard some of their stories. And later I took my youth Sunday school class to Friday prayers and had a chance to talk to the imam afterwards. And I thought that was a really good experience. So I think building those kinds of relationships is really important.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hear you talk about that, and some of that is just sort of basic journalism, right? I mean, we talk about setting aside religious journalism. We talk a lot about at the Tribune with our young reporters of you need to be trying to build relationships with people before the big crisis comes, right? If the state lawmaker, if the first time you're calling his office is when he's been accused of embezzling funds or whatever, he's not going to take your call. He's not going to talk to you. If you're trying to talk to him 5 minutes before the massive vote on his bill goes through, he's not going to have time for you. But if you've built that relationship of trust ahead of time, you will be able to hopefully, be more productive when the big story comes along. Absolutely. I wonder though about kind of other aspects of journalism as we see it, as we approach our job, like the accountability aspect of this. There's been a lot of talk today about Christian nationalism. A lot of talk about, what folks pushing this idea believe and how it does or does not align with the teachings of Jesus or what's in the Bible and all those types of things. I hear about that. I hear calls for holding folks like that accountable. That kind of makes me nervous, right? Because I, as a journalist, have a hard time, it's a lot easier to fact check the mayor saying, we cut taxes, did you cut taxes or not? It's when you're fact checking someone's interpretation of scripture, you're wading into some pretty dangerous grounds there. I mean, how do you think we as journalists should be approaching, I guess, how do those tools of journalism translate to writing about religion? Where do they connect? Where do they not?
Certainly. Well, I was dropping off my son at daycare and was listening to the opening keynote and immediately had to grab my phone because Dr. Jones said a term that I'm going to capture and use, this idea of nostalgia voters. And that resonated very deeply with me, particularly with this mantra around Make America Great Again. Now, I'm someone who believes in embodiment, and indeed sometimes you tell the story better through the images. And so we have individuals who are saying, make America great again. But what does again mean? And for whom? Was this when America was great? Is this what we're talking about? In terms of our community, we want to know, when was America great? Is this what we're looking for? For America to be great again? Is this what we're talking about? All right, or maybe it's this. Maybe someone has an idea of this as America being great again. And you can't dismiss the fact that the majority of white Christians in this country and in this state voted for an image of American greatness that looks like this. And the level of harm that it brings, the lives that are literally crushed to the earth because of this theology and political ideology that is being pushed forward. And where I think the media could be helpful, and understand that there are a necessary balance that the media has to engage in. But none of this is normal. And anytime we normalize or give platform to white supremacy and to racial harm, I think we continue to exasperate the damage and the harm that's being experienced by communities. Sometimes you just got to name what it is. Now, within my context, I think that the Black church historically has served as a check on this narrative through our rhetoric, both verbal as well as our embodied resistance. But that's one of the things that I heard today, is that we are a rabidly racist community. And yet we don't often state that publicly. Going back to the next panel, I know we have much more conversation to talk about, but there was a conversation about all of the wonderful things that religious groups are doing on a daily basis to help individuals with their daily lives, providing services. And yet when those same religious adherents go to vote, they vote for policies that do not bring about human flourishing and abundance for all people. I would much rather live in a society that decided that we were going to take care of our neighbors and do that well than to just continue to provide services to those who continue to be crushed to the ground.
Thank you for that. I want to ask, we were talking in the hallway earlier about, one thing that is kind of bouncing in my mind after hearing these conversations. A lot of people have cited the statistic that was raised at the beginning of the day about 14% of Texans are white evangelicals, a very small portion of the population, and that there are so many other stories to tell. I mean, you also just described, a very scary mindset that has a massive effect on the community that you are a part of and that you help lead. There has been a lot of talk today about, a certain segment of Christian nationalism that also, it may represent a small segment of this population, but that is having a massive effect on the lives of everyone, right? I think one of the things that I think as I sit through these conversations today is, how do you balance that, right? How do you not overemphasize or give a one-sided portrayal of religion and how it works, while also not downplaying or diminishing the real impacts that a certain segment of the religious population is having on the lives of everyday Texans. I wonder what you think about how journalism should kind of approach dilemma, for a lack of a better term?
Yeah, I think it's definitely challenging, and I think there has to be balance. Of course, you have to report on Christian nationalism, and I think you also have to clearly name it as an inherently anti-democratic ideology, because it just is. And that's just a sort of descriptive term. I don't even think that's a prescriptive framing of what Christian nationalism is. But yet, as we know too, Christian nationalism can, and also just the fundamentalist white evangelicalism can really suck all the air out of the room, and it could be the only thing that we hear or see. Before this event, I was kind of looking at some of the social media posts promoting this event and looking at some of the comments. I know you're not supposed to look at the comments, but I was looking at some of the comments. And I noted how many people were commenting that religion is the worst thing that's ever happened to us. Why would you even want to have this event? Who wants to talk about religion? Religion's just a horrible thing. It's the bane of our existence. And I have to assume that these people have had negative experiences with religion. They also feel like they've had it, they've been bashed on the head with it. But I'm also assuming they've had negative experiences with a particular religion, and I could guess what religion that is, right? And so this is part of ways in which, Christian nationalism and the white evangelical, fundamentalist experience can kind of suck all the air out of the room. So I think it's really important that journalists make some effort to tell and to portray religion as being more complex than that, so people can see that that's not a singular religious experience, and really begin to see that just the myriad of ways in which people experience religion, including outside of Christianity. And I think there's, in many ways for this reason, it's very important, even though non-Christian religions make up a very small segment of Texan society, they probably need more attention because people know so little about them. And then it can also kind of counter this really dominant and sometimes oppressive narrative that people feel like they've gotten too much of.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot about how much people's perception of religion is shaped by the type of journalism they consume, right? There is a very strong demand for political journalism. The Texas Tribune is a political journalism outlet, and a lot of the writing we do is about the influence on the religious right into politics. But of course, religion has had a lot of influence in our government for a very long time. There were religious leaders at the forefront of the civil rights movement. There were religious leaders at the forefront of the anti-war movement, anti-poverty initiatives, environmental initiatives, and everything like that. How do you think the journalism? Do you think people are getting the breadth of sort of journalism's influence on American life right now from the reporting that people are getting out there in the world? And this is a question for you, Sarah.
Well, thank you. So just continue on from what Dan shared earlier. So coming at this from a social science perspective, we know that how people respond to political issues is strongly shaped by the media they consume, and how people's responses to social movements is strongly shaped by the media that they consume. And if they understand religion in kind of a binary, polarized way, either all good or all bad, then they're going to respond to these issues in the same way. It's interesting. I was just sharing earlier with a group. I've done some research on, say, Christian nationalism and civic and political engagement. And the reality is that Christian nationalism as an ideology works differently than religious participation. So we found that people who attend frequently, they're engaged in volunteering activities, they're engaged in political activity like protesting or signing petitions. But Christian nationalism is not associated with any of those activities. And the only political activity it's associated with is voting for Trump. And so this is an important kind of thing to remind ourselves is there's a lot of variation that happens within different religious communities. And in fact, they can be quite supportive of the common good. And looking only at Christian nationalism really is a very small slice of what's happening on the ground. And the more that, from a reporting perspective, you can draw attention to those kinds of stories, I think that can shape people's understanding of what's happening and in turn shape their responses to what's happening.
Dr. Waters, you laid out a very, I think, powerful refutation of the idea of kind of nostalgia in religion and in our politics as well. And I don't want to in any way kind of diminish that, what you laid out, because I think you're exactly right. But I also think about people who look toward the past, who look at the stats that were presented about just declining religious affiliation in this country, right? And thinking of the perspective of people who want to bring that more back into public life, and they feel, they were raised in a church, they see, fewer people like them going to church, church attendance rates going down. They even talk about, our country's history in which separation of church and state was vitally important, but a lot of the decisions, dating back to our founders were driven in some ways by their religion too. I mean, you don't have to read deeply into the, Declaration of Independence, for instance, without hearing about the Creator and about God and everything like that. And I do wonder about, how some people are reacting to this, and what may be driving this is a personal fear of like, I'm raising my kids in a society where society might be pulling them away from religion in some ways. And I'm curious, like, is that something that people at your church feel as well? Is there any way that you relate to that fear in any way, even if your reaction to it is vastly different than the reaction of some people?
I think from our tradition, we have often looked at the hypocrisy of the American enterprise. If you go to Philadelphia, the same road in which the Declaration of Independence is penned on is the road that the slave depot was on. And so literally while the Declaration is being written, there are people in chains moving across. And so the question is, what type of remembrance do we want to have? Within Hebraic tradition, they have a word called zakar. And zakar means remembrance, but it means more than remembrance. It means remembrance that spurs action. In the West African conception, it's one called sankofa, to go back and fetch it. Both of them have an emphasis on a remembrance that brings about action. And what you remember, in many ways, defines who you are. And so when you see, for instance, this debate between the 1716 project and the 1619 project, this is a debate about remembrance. And how we remember defines who we are. So, to your question, I think it's a different experience when you are in a time period where any remembrance of your progress or participation is literally being erased in real time, being scrubbed from websites, being banned to be taught within educational facilities. And so once you're no longer remembered, you no longer exist. And I think that's really the challenge that's before us. And so when we talk about these kind of debating narratives, it's really about existence. And there's an existential threat that's happening to many of our communities. And so for some, I think it's problematic when we enter new ideals into the remembrance. They want to remember a nation, very much so, for instance, I think of it like Leave It to Beaver, right? A white utopia. But when I look at Leave It to Beaver, I'm also thinking about what's happening in the background, what's happening on the other side of town. Who are the domestics that are serving those homes, and what harms have they had historically? So we are in a fight for memory within this country, We're in a fight for, based on what we remember, how that is going to form the future in which we go into. And so I think it's not as easily packaged an idea to say that, well, yes, some people just want to have some nostalgia for years past, because if their only remembrance is of Leave It to Beaver, but they don't remember that Emmett Till's happened around Leave It to Beaver time, then it is an incomplete memory.
JB, I want to talk a little bit about how this plays out in an individual community. I mean, when the Waco Bridge is, fully off and running, telling stories, all the other types of journalism that you do, what to you is success journalistically in terms of coverage of religion and religious communities and the influence of religion in that community? What does that look like to you?
Yeah, I think that hopefully what people would come away with is an understanding of other traditions and other faith communities in a way that you couldn't find on their website. I mean, I can look at the Lutheran Missouri Synod and find out what they believe and whatever. But to go to a church, to go to an African American church on a Sunday morning and stay there and stay for dinner, stay for lunch, dinner, whatever. To me, that is that sort of like observing, like you see the way that people really are and what that community actually is. And I think that's maybe what's missing is we rush too much to, just to try to put people into boxes. This person is a white evangelical. This person is a Hispanic Catholic. We're sorting people into these boxes, but within a single church, you may have 100 different opinions. And so I think just being curious about other people's traditions and setting aside your own immediate reaction to them and just listening is really the first thing I think a journalist should do.
Dr. Goff, what about you? I won't ask you specifically about Waco, but as in Texas, in our country, I mean, what do you want to see out of the journalism that's being done around religion?
Well, thank you. So right now we're in the middle of a big project in Houston where we're studying religious leaders in Houston, how they work together across lines of difference to solve common social problems and to promote the good. And one of the things that we found in this research is that there's several things that are really impeding this kind of common good approach to working across religious difference that actually have nothing to do with politics or religion. It actually has to do with just some concrete things like the cost of insurance for religious congregational buildings, or the kind of increase in demands on religious leaders in terms of their time and their resources. And they tell us what all that we can do is take care of our congregation. I don't have time to reach out, and to do other things because of the demands that are on us. And we talked a little bit about that with some mental health challenges. There's an organization that works with religious leaders in Houston called the Minaret Foundation. And one of the interesting things that they've done is they've gathered religious leaders from across the spectrum of different traditions to work on legislation and things to deal with this insurance issue. As you can imagine, in Houston, we have hurricanes, and they tend to cause destruction, and destruction raises insurance premiums, and insurance premiums have an impact on things like civic life of religious leaders. So these are the kinds of things that we're discovering through our research, are ways that different religious leaders can come together to serve the common good. And I think it would be interesting and I think useful for journalists to cover this, not only for people to be able to share about what they're doing, but also for us to know more about it and how that works.
What about you, Dr. Puett?
So a lot of the work that we do at IDCL really centers around, telling a bigger story of Texas. We have a project called Religions Texas, in which it's a large-scale oral history project. We've gathered stories from religious folks and communities in Texas, and we look a lot for what we call the unheard stories. We want to create spaces to amplify those unheard voices and create spaces where people can tell their stories on their own terms. And through this work, we have found that a lot of people really do just want to be heard, and they really do, and when they have those spaces just to represent themselves on their own terms, that it feels very empowering and really gratifying for them. And I think that these are the kinds of relationships that journalists can be building with communities. And I think the previous panel that someone mentioned this when there was a question about the kinds of stories that journalists could be that telling, and someone said in response something along the lines of, well, you could just come and talk to us instead of making us tell you the story. Like, what if we have conversations and you learn more about us, and then you can kind of from there glean what those stories are and really work with us. And that seems like that also is part of that model of community journalism that you've been talking about, is really building those partnerships and relationships. So, and I think for this whole event too, I think that's part of what really motivated the collaboration between IDCL and the Texas Tribune and Religion News Service, is that we all see the value of working with communities and building those kinds of partnerships and thinking about how we can make sure that everyone's voice gets heard.
Dr. Waters, I wonder, you talked a little bit about how, during the civil rights era in particular, there was, many religious leaders really kind of viewed the media as a ally or a necessary kind of helper in getting their message out. We're in a different world now. I think back to the protests on university campuses last year, and how many of those protesters very specifically were asking the media not to write about them or did not want to talk. There's obviously, of course, also just many different ways these days to get your message out kind of without the filter of the media. How do you sort of view that relationship? Do you feel like you even need journalism in the media in order to get your word out, in order to do the work that you might have needed television or newspapers to have done, decades ago?
I will use a case in point specifically related to the Texas Tribune. Unfortunately, not as many Texans know as should know that the Department of Justice came down with a report in August of last year concerning the Texas Juvenile Justice Department, noting that young people within our facilities have the highest rate of sexual assault of any young person in any facility in the country, that canisters intended to be used to disperse crowds were being used upon youth, and a number of other very horrible experiences. And the coverage of the Tribune around these atrocities proved very helpful for me in the work and advocacy that I'm engaged in the ability to share it widely and to point out that here is a journalistic integrity that is illuminating a great concern within our state that is getting far less coverage than it should. So I think there's tremendous value, certainly, for journalistic integrity and individuals who are willing to probe the issues that matter to human lives. I make that distinction between journalistic integrity to what I unfortunately see happening in many cable news networks that appear more like maybe news entertainment or some type of panel that's just in continuous cycle that never actually gets to the what do we do now. And so part of my inspiration for being even a part of this is that, and some of you may know, but Dr. King's final book was entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? And in '68, Dr. King gave us two opportunities. We either move towards community or we move towards chaos. And I think that with journalistic integrity, the media can help us move towards community. by addressing the things that separate us and that harm us. So to that point, I think there's still great value. I find it very valuable in the work in which I'm engaged. I do know that there is a level of suspicion that is necessary because of sometimes the way the media has harmed. But I do think there's still great value. And I think it is to our detriment, particularly around written news media and the paper, the diminishing of the daily, I think is something that I truly regret. And I hope to see flourish in years to come.
All right, we will now turn to Matt with audience questions.
Thank you so much. This person, I want to read the question and then add a little bit from here. Elva from Arlington wrote, "Where's the representation from the non-believer community today? The media should definitely report more on how and why non-believers are a fast-growing cohort, but this is rarely covered." I want to add, and not to modify Elva's question, but to, one, credit Elva for watching the program today, but also to make a distinction, just as within faith traditions, those who may be anti-religion and their rhetoric, or someone who identifies themselves as a non-believer, where is the space for that kind of discourse between those who are in the non-believer community and faith communities?
Well, that is a great question, and it's a really important point. Even during the first presentation, we mentioned that the unclassified, unaffiliated group is compared to others the largest religious group in Texas and even in the U.S. It's interesting. One of the things in our research that we found is when you look at the different types of unaffiliated, atheist, agnostic, and then just the religious nuns, we found that atheists, in fact, were the most likely to join with Muslims in pro-Palestinian protests, so out of all the different religious groups. And so it's really important that we understand, not just that was on a national level, but even on a state level, that we look at both religion and non-religion, because as was mentioned earlier, they interact, they respond to each other, and it's a really important part of both social and civic life as well as political life.
I would just add just a quick bit of insight from the planning process for this event. It was something that we discussed, and basically we did not have enough space in the day to include all of the perspectives that we wanted to include. So that was a perspective that we discussed including. We also, other perspectives that weren't included, we did not have space to talk about LGBTQ plus issues in the state, as well as other issues related to kind of the politics of the body and how that connects to religion. And that felt like something that we wish we had space and time for. We also, very clearly did not include representation from all the religions that we could have included as well. So I think that means we have to have another symposium, right?
No, just to add a comment, there's a kind of unpacking and unsettling that I think happened today that just points to the work going forward. A couple questions that get to journalism and like a yes and. KT from Dallas writes, it was mentioned that the journalism community is shrinking and how difficult it is to deeply cover the vast amounts of niche groups. Is there any belief that maybe community groups and grassroots brand or organizations are taking a more active role of sharing these stories than relying less on a journalist to do the job on their behalf? Do we think there is a shift in how media is being exported given the lack of trust in journalism and American media?
I don't think that's solely the case, because the reality is that it's very dangerous to be a journalist today. Probably always has been, but maybe no more at another time and period than it is now. And when you are seeking a vocation, you're taking great risk if you are speaking the truth or reporting the facts as is? And how do you report the facts in a post-truth age when somebody else's facts may differ from yours? Certainly, I think there are opportunities for partnership between communities, and I think that there are communities that are telling their story. There are church newsletters. There are church historians. There are Black newspapers or newspapers by other minority groups or religious groups that could partner with larger media, right? But I don't just look at the diminishing number, if you will, of journalists as a sign of disinterest. I also see it as a sign of the times. When you have individuals, I think of Joy Reid, who are released from very high platforms because of the truth that they tell. There may be individuals who are weighing it in the balance and wondering whether or not this is something that I want to engage in this way.
Mara from Dallas asks, what forms of new media are the content, they say content creators on stage, but exploring or hearing about, or how are they reimagining their use of media forms they use now to convey their message? And Matthew, I'm also just thinking about work of the Tribune and how to reach audiences differently based on what we're learning.
Yeah, I think this kind of goes a little bit back to the prior question too, which is I think there are absolutely opportunities, with social media and other types of media for people to tell sort of their own stories by bypassing journalists. And I think that's great for the most part. I have some problems with, what certain social media algorithms promote and various things like that. But ultimately, like, giving people a voice is great. This is not necessarily a religious example, but the Me Too movement is a perfect example of something that probably wouldn't have happened if we didn't have those tools going out there. I think journalism itself what it can do is sort of, hopefully when it's being done well, is pull people sort of out of their echo chambers. It can kind of, share perspectives and experiences of people that are not like you, people that you might not be inclined to follow or talk to or see at your own church or any of those types of situations. And, that's one of the reasons I got into journalism, was the opportunity to expose myself to other different types of people and to tell their stories and be involved in telling their stories. It is true, though, that we have a lot of work to do as an industry to reach audiences, right? One of the examples I always pull up is, like, you look at the picture of people riding the New York subway in the 1950s, and every single person is reading a newspaper. And today, if you took a picture of the New York subway, everyone would be looking at their phone. But they're not just reading news stories on their phone, they're playing games and watching Netflix and all different other types of things, right? And so what we are working on, what we are trying to do, is finding ways to sort of be more meeting people where they are, as opposed to expecting them to just type in texastribune.org to find our stories. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. There's newsletters, there's events, there's, we're experimenting with podcasts and social video and all different types of aspects that will try to reach people and try to sort of inject into those platforms some truth and some, honest and sensitive tellings of other people's experiences and everything like that, in the hopes of sort of, elevating that dialogue going on.
I would add to that I feel, as I've always felt as a journalist, especially in the last few years, that for every journalist out there, there's probably 10 PR people who are being paid to deliver a message. And, like, how great is it to be in a community where there's people who wake up every morning with the idea of just thinking, well, what's important to our community and how can I go report on it, and without having an agenda. I mean, I think that most people would want that, but I think there's a distrust that has grown up, maybe because of decisions we've made or arrogance that we've had as journalists. But I think in principle, it seems like everybody would want that. and not just to depend on some slick video that a church or city government or whoever or institution puts out, but to actually have a news coverage where you could get multiple perspectives, where it's clear that whoever put it together isn't taking sides and is trying to get to the truth.
I do it as today comes to a close, and I think it's certainly reminded us of the work that is required of all of us in different respects as we think about these larger issues. But I just love to welcome all in the panel. Then I'll have Matthew and Tiffany offer some kind of final remarks. All those who joined us in person and online care in one way or another about this larger issue, and I'm wondering if you have a specific takeaway recommendation for what people can take with them, how they can be thinking differently, so that there's some sense of agency from the conversation today.
If you want to start.
Sure.
Look at you.
So some sense of agency. Yeah. That's a great question. And I think in the context of journalism and the media, right, it can be hard because you have little control. And this would be the same for lots of institutions. One thing that we've been thinking about as we think about religious pluralism and conflict that arises out of it is we do a lot of work in sort of analyzing the conditions that lead to problems. And as Dan mentioned earlier, sociologists, we tend to be very pessimistic. But I think there is some hope, and we've heard some of those stories today. And I think, as much as we do kind of the deconstructive work of looking at how looking at problems, I think we're at a really critical point to do some constructive work about what the future can look like and how we can continue to cultivate a religiously plural democracy. This kind of vision, I think, is something that we've had but not always held on to, and this is a good time to really think about that, not just sort of at the institutional level, but individually to think about and to engage in conversations, particularly across lines of difference, about how we can keep and maintain, a pluralistic democracy.
We just want to go down the line. Again, I'm going to share some thoughts as an organizer. Part of what we wanted to do for this event was bring together folks from what we thought of as 3 different stakeholder groups: journalists, community leaders, and religion scholars, although particularly religion scholars that are doing public-facing work, right? Really interested in translating their work for the public. And I think that, we see all 3 of these groups as being stakeholders in this larger conversation. We all have something at stake. We're all thinking about narrative and messaging. But I also think that there's a way, too, in which this conversation is also part of the way forward, right? Like we all bring different perspectives, different concerns, different interests, but yet there is some kind of common ground here. And I think that we all have a lot to learn from each other. And I think this has been a really valuable conversation. And I hope there can be more of those in the future. And I think that, this is part of that process of building community and stepping outside of comfort zones and, trying to get other perspectives on things that may be very familiar to us, trying to see them from a different lens. So I'm really grateful that we've been able to come together in this way and have this conversation, and hope there will be more of these in the future.
Saturday before last, I was in Washington, D.C., standing at the former Black Lives Matter Plaza, which is being bulldozed and jackhammered away. But I wasn't just standing by myself. I was standing with 18 women, 16 mothers, 2 aunts who lost their loved ones to police violence. And as we stood at the place where a phrase that encapsulates the memory of their loved one was being removed, the question is, what does this feel like? And it feels like the bodies of their deceased loved ones being exhumed and the pain being brought to the fore. We're living in a time where people are being disappeared, placed on planes and flown away from their families, possibly never to be seen or heard of again. These are not normal times. And these are times that will demand of us a level of courage that we might not have known as recently in our history. And it is going to demand courage from a number of entities, a number of groups, but certainly from the media, to be able to boldly shine the light. That's what Ida B. Wells stated as a part of her documenting of lynchings within this nation, to shine the light of truth. And so my hope, and certainly grateful for the time that we've shared together, is that we would leave from here with a renewed commitment together to continue to shine the light of truth on what these times are. Because if we don't, what is soon to come, and may in fact already be here, will be very hard to undo.
When I hear Dr. Goff talking about building alliances or building ties across diversity, you said it better than I can. But when I think about that, I just think how difficult that would be if it's only on a limit, the matter of national politics, or religion, and how important, our communities are, the place where we actually live and, actually physically are present with other people. So I think that the Waco Bridge, this is kind of an experiment in that of, in a time where there's such distrust on a national level, where people are drawing lines in the sand and retreating into their camps. I believe that there's still a place in our local communities where we can build relationships across those lines, whether they're political, cultural, or religious. Even though some of those may be severely strained, as Dr. Waters was talking about, because of historical injustices. But I think that this symposium has been, a reminder to me of how important it is to get to know, for us to educate ourselves about other religious traditions and the diversity of that in Texas. And so I think one thing as we start the Waco Bridge is think about how we can really educate ourselves in these topics. So this is a good start.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of, I think one of the themes that has sort of emerged today has been that there's a lot of fear out there, right? There's a lot of fear, going back to the first conversation of the day around, the state of our government. There's a lot of fear about, what some perceive as the decline of religion in our country. There's been talk about Islamophobia, about, pressure on the media, about all different types of things. I think, when there is fear, there can sometimes be an incentive to sort of step away from the values that you carry. I won't, profess to, of the 3 groups that you described that are here to, define or anything the values of the other 2 groups. But I think just like from a journalist perspective, from someone who leads a newsroom, making sure that we hold on to those values of seeking to understand, reporting without fear, of the consequences, telling the truth, but also without sensationalism or or anything like that. And, keep doing our job as we define it, not letting other folks define it, and keep trying to honestly portray people from across the ideological, religious, and other types of perspectives, what they're experiencing, what's driving them, so that we have good information to kind of move forward and advance on that is something that, I think we believe in at the Tribune and want to continue to, learn from and carry forward from an event like this as well.
With that, we close this day's conversations, but the conversations and work continues. I want to acknowledge our program partners' incredible collaboration with the Institute for Diversity and Civic Life, Religion News Service, and SMU's Religious Studies Department, and just thankful for the support of our sponsors, the Henry Luce Foundation, Humanities Texas, and the Eula May and John Bow Foundation, and all of those who, through your attendance, through your questions, made this conversation so powerful today. Thank you.